Hey everybody, welcome back to Jim's Garage. In this video, we're going to be setting up our own private end-to-end encrypted photo storage solution that works both on the desktop and mobile. And before you ask, hey, is this Photoprism or is this Immich? No, it's not. Both those are great, but today we're talking about Ente. And the bit that makes Ente special is what I've just said. It's that end-to-end encryption. Now, this could be the perfect replacement for your Google Photos or your iCloud or whatever, and you can make use of having something that's embedded into your mobile device and also that is hosted privately on your infrastructure, or it could be anywhere, say a VPS or somewhere else that you trust and you manage. The benefits here over things like Immich and Photoprism are that it is end-to-end encrypted. That means, I'm looking at you probably watching this video, you're the admin. The people that you invite or let use this, you're not going to be able to see all of their pictures. They have the keys on their device, they generate it, much like things like WhatsApp for example, and only they can decrypt those images. That gives you then the perfect solution for privacy and also affordability. So by the end of this video, we'll have this spun up within Docker in a single compose file. I'll go through all of the configuration steps. It will be running behind traffic, but I'll also include the files for just a vanilla setup, i.e. not behind a reverse proxy, and you can decide what you want to do. Now, Ente hasn't been public for long. I think it came out late summer, and they're really keen to sort of take over this space. Now, they do provide a paid version if you want to use their storage locations, again with the benefits of it being end-to-end encrypted, but hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to do everything you need on your own. So let's fire up VS Studio, let's get this thing deployed. So over on my Docker VM, let's go through the compose file that's required and the necessary configuration files. So as you can see off the bat here, we've got a multi-container setup. Now those are Museum, SOCAT, Postgres, MinIO, and we also have a provisioning one. So what are those? Well, let's start from the top. So the Museum is basically, in their terms, where you store your precious things, much like a museum, aka those photos. So this is basically the bit that binds everything together. So when you're connecting via your mobile app or web app, you actually connect to Museum and you connect on that 8080 port, which you can put behind a reverse proxy like I've done here. I will go through all of these in more detail. Now, because this is a museum and this is just the front end, it actually needs to store some stuff. And where it stores stuff, I'll come back to this in a minute, is in Postgres. So this is your typical Postgres database, where it will store things like the users, etc., and some of those keys. And then it also has MinIO, which is an object-based storage database. So this is where your actual files that are encrypted get stored. The last thing here really is this for provisioning, and again, this is just really for setting up. This MinIO provision and the SOCAT one, they're kind of ephemeral containers. So let's go back to the top and let's go through this now with that knowledge of how it's architected. And you should also note that for this to work, the client you're connecting from, i.e. your desktop or your mobile, is going to need to have direct access to both Museum and the MinIO data store. Because what happens is the API is served from both Museum, but when you actually do an upload, it does a direct connection to the MinIO data object storage database. It doesn't connect to Museum, which then routes it through a backend. It directly uploads to that object storage. So let's have a look through this. So for the Museum container, you can actually build this, and there's the command to build. If you wanted to build it, you would uncomment it, and you're off to the races. I'm just using the pre-compiled Docker image to save time. I didn't notice any errors when I was doing this, and I didn't really see any reason to build this from scratch. Now, this is a bit of a double-edged sword here with the ports. Technically, I could actually just do this because I'm running it through a reverse proxy, but if you're not going to, you'll want to leave those uncommented, and that'll allow you to connect through the IP address of the host, the Docker host, and the port 8080. Now, the Prometheus metrics, I've just commented out. I'm not going to use those, but if you did want to do some monitoring, you could obviously connect to that endpoint. Now, this container takes advantage of the depends on, and it's going to depend on the Postgres, which is one of the containers later on, being up and that service being healthy, i.e. start the database first, wait until that's healthy, because this museum wants to connect to the database. Obviously, this container would fail if the database wasn't ready, because it would try and connect and it's just not available. So it waits for it. Now the environment takes in this credentials.yaml file, and we'll come on to all of the configurations in a later part. Next we get onto the volumes. Now I like to use bind mounts, but you can use Docker volumes if you want. I found that bind mounts are easier because you can navigate to them much simpler, and it's easier to back up in my opinion. So we've got some custom logs here. We've got the museum.yaml. This is an important file, and what this does is essentially it overwrites a lot of the test files. So things like the credentials, for example, you will actually have a museum.yaml file which will have subsets of all of those. So by default it uses files like this, but you can overwrite everything with a YAML file, the museum.yaml. Kind of think of that as a master config. I'll show all of this later on. Next, we're going to mount all of these files into the container, so that credentials one here, but again, it gets overwritten by this. And then we have, for the museum itself, a data folder for this museum. So it's basically where it stores its data. Now, I'm running this in a dual network stack. So I've got the Ente network. So that's where all of these containers can talk to themselves. This is a private network only, so nothing outside of the Docker environment can talk to this, but those containers can use it to talk privately. But because I want this to be internet facing, or at least through a reverse proxy, I put this on my proxy traffic network, which I've set up in previous videos. Now, to get this working, there's not too much to do in terms of labels. It's pretty much copy and paste from most of my videos. So we set up the standard proxy labels. Important one here is this one here. You will want to change the docker.network to be proxy. In a multi-network setup like this, I think it does sort of a round robin choice unless you specify it. So we're deliberately specifying here that it's on the proxy network, which is the one that's exposed. This tripped me up a little bit, and I feel a bit of a noob for forgetting about this one. If you do miss this one out, what will probably happen is it will go onto the Ente network and you won't be able to access it. After that, really, it's pretty straightforward. We put it on port 8080 or whatever you're going to run it on. That's the one it expects to run on up here. You can change that default port if you want to with an environment variable. And then we get onto our good old friend, the cores, the cross-origin stuff. Now, we've had this before in the head scale video where we set up a front end for head scale. And this is basically a security feature which stops sort of cross-origin. So all I'm saying here really is you are allowed to come from a different subdomain. In this case here, we've got Ente and min.io. We'll come on to min.io in a minute, but hopefully it's self-explanatory. Basically, you can do all of these things from these websites, and these are the values I've taken from the Ente documentation. Once those cores are loaded, what that means is when you're using the web app and the mobile app, you can actually do the upload. If you don't put these cores in, when you try and do that upload, because it's from a different subdomain in the way I have it set up, it's going to complain about a cores error, and ultimately your upload will fail. Thankfully, in the app, there is a developer mode, so if you've screwed this up somehow, it will come out and say, hey, there's a cores error. Next, we have the SOCAT. Now, this one isn't technically required because we're running it through a reverse proxy, but I've kind of left it in case you're not going to. So this pulls down basically the SOCAT. It binds it onto the museum network. You'll have seen messing around with the network mode in my VPN video, where we use things like Gluton to route all of our containers through a VPN. And basically what that's doing is just saying, hey, what is the address for museum? So this one up here. Now, we don't need to worry about that because we've bound it through traffic to a DNS entry, in that case, ent.jimsgarage.co.uk. But what this allows it to do is get the address, and then what it can do is run on the Ente network, which is that private network, so it knows where it is. It will then pass those values onto the various containers later on in the script. Next, we get onto the actual database itself, and it's using Postgres 15, and it's bound to this port here on the Ente network. Now, obviously you want to change these users and the password and the database, but I'm just leaving these here as they were the example. Now, it does that health check here, so the command is it ready? And if we scroll back up, remember that wait condition here? We're doing this Postgres depends on service healthy. So this script will only continue, or it will only succeed, if this comes back with a positive health check. And that's important because it shows that the database is actually working. Obviously, we're going to bind this data to somewhere locally or use a data volume. I've just put it in the ent/postgres data folder, and we're going to stick it onto that ent network. Next comes the actual object storage database, and that's using min.io. Now, you can use this one here, which I'm using, or you can use an external provider. So you could use something like an S3 bucket in AWS, and that is an example on their website. Shouldn't matter too much which one you use, as long as it speaks S3. Now, I won't go into setting up AWS, so do refer to their documentation, but essentially it comes down to specifying an endpoint and putting in the right credentials, and it should be able to just connect. So this runs on 3200 and 3201. Again, I'm running this through a reverse proxy, so we should be able to get rid of the 3200 port that's exposed and just run it through the reverse proxy. We're going to specify some usernames and some passwords. And for me, when I'm running this behind a reverse proxy, I had to add in this environment variable here, which basically says this is where min.io is going to be accessible externally. And that's needed to get around the cause issue. Now, when this starts up, it's going to bind itself to 3200 and 3201. And if you wanted to change those, if these ports were taken, you could obviously do that here. The data itself is going to reside in ent min.io-data. And what's interesting here is you actually get a console for going into min.io itself. So it actually has a web interface. And when we upload some pictures and things, you'll actually be able to see those files in the database, albeit they'll be encrypted and useless. So we can download and we can try and open it, but it's end-to-end encrypted. We don't have the keys to see what that image is. This will reside on both networks, so it needs to be on both the Ent for talking to things like the database and museum, but it also needs to be exposed on the proxy network, because when I'm on my mobile phone or my desktop and I'm running it behind a reverse proxy, we showed in the model earlier whereby the client needs access to both the museum and the object store directly. Then we get onto the proxy labels, and this is pretty much cookie cutter from any of the videos you've watched on me. We're using the same standard traffic labels here. The next container is the provisioning of min.io. So all this really does is you'll see it's calling this min.io provision script. And if you look inside that script, all it's doing is setting up the buckets where the objects are going to be stored. So it's basically initializing the object storage, and you'll see that this depends on min.io. So this provisioning, i.e. the configuration of min.io, will happen once min.io is up and running. And it will use this data here to go and do that. This one only needs to set on the Ent network, and that's because it's not going to be directly exposed. And it has an entry point here where it's going to run this script to go and set that up. At the bottom, we've got the standard networks, so it's going to sit on Ent, which I created for this video, and it's going to use the external network of proxy so that I can access this through my reverse proxy, and I get a nice SSL tick and everything in the browser, and we don't get any nasty privacy warnings. So this is using a reverse proxy, and there's a version here that's not using a reverse proxy, and I'll add this, but it's essentially the same as before, just bit more simplistic. So let's get now onto the configuration. So for the configuration, you'll see that I'm using /home, Ubuntu, and Docker. So if I close down the compose folder and I actually go to the Docker folder, this one here, you'll see within Docker, I've got this Ent folder here. And so within Ent, I've created these folders before I started the machine up. And I created the custom logs, the data, the min.io data, Postgres, scripts, and that museum.yaml. So go and create those folders. I will be giving you the files you need to change, and you can find those on my GitHub as usual. So the key thing really here is we want to go to this museum.yaml. And as I said, this will override the defaults. So here we've got HTTP. Now, because we're using this behind a reverse proxy, we don't actually have to specify and set up our own certificates, albeit if you're not using a reverse proxy and you do have some certificates, you could change this to true, and there's a separate section just for using and specifying where those certs are. The next bit is this apps, and this basically sets the public endpoint for where you want your Ent to be accessible on. And as I mentioned before, this is ent.jimsgarage.co.uk. What I do recommend you set up is SMTP. And what this will do is when users join your server, by default, it uses multi-factor authentication. So when they sign up, it's going to ask them to verify their email address, and that will be used for token generation. Now, for this video, I'm not going to set that up, but it's as simple as going to your email provider and getting the SMTP credentials and just plugging them in here. Because I'm going to be doing this locally, we can actually, and just for a single user myself at the moment, we can actually just go into the logs of the museum container and we can see that one-time password that we need. But I strongly advise you do go and set this up, but it will be different for every provider. I have shown how to do SMTP before in previous videos. The last crucial thing really is this S3 section, and that's the object storage for that min.io container. Now, the way this works is there are two methods here. I'm saying are the buckets local and setting that to true. That's because that is true. We've specified min.io in that same Docker Compose stack. Now, if you're using an external one, there's an additional command that you can put in here that says that the bucket is not local, and that will use a different format. But I recommend you spinning this up yourself, leaving this as is this, and then on this endpoint you specify what the IP or the DNS record is for this. So the URL I've got is that https min.io.jimsgarage.co.uk, and that works because I'm putting it behind my traffic reverse proxy. Now obviously change the key, change the secret, but basically this is really the only thing that you'll need to change if you want to run it behind a reverse proxy. If you're not using a reverse proxy, just put in the IP address and the port of the system you're using. After that, there isn't really much more to talk about. Let's have a quick look at those scripts. There's the credentials. So here you'll see the credentials file that we mentioned earlier. Now this can be overwritten using that museum file. So think of these as basically the default, and this is the master, and if you put anything in this block, it will forget about this and it will use the value in here. So in here you can set your database username and password, which is referenced in the Docker Compose file, and confusingly you'll also see another S3 section here. Now you can use this one. If you don't put it in museum here, if you delete this, it will use the value in here. And what's good about this is I believe this is dynamic from the documentation. So if you don't have it in museum and you have it in here, if you make changes here, it will dynamically try and update and change that. But if you put it in the museum, this is kind of done at build and run time. So this is more for a production ready setup, and this is more for a testing setup. I've left this in here just for when I was doing testing, and I've confirmed that if you have it in the museum and the credentials, it will pick this up and there's no issue with having it still in credentials. So just for awareness, you can have that in there and you can do some testing. Next thing we talked about was that min.io provision and some of those scripts that get run. So basically all this is doing is setting up these three data stores. So it actually sets up 3 buckets that you can use. Now, I've not touched anything on that just because there's no real detriment to setting those 3 up. And by default, it uses this one here, i.e. the first in the list. But you can use the comment of being a hot bucket, and you can assign that to one of these, and then it will change which one is actually the default when used. You don't need to worry about this, it's just more for knowledge, and you can find out more information about this on their website. So that's basically all of the configuration steps that are required to replicate how I have this set up. Do check the documentation to see if there's anything else that you might want to do, but this should give you an out-the-box SSL encrypted, end-to-end encrypted place to store all of your photos. So let's get now into the deployment process. So to do that, I'm going to hop into the terminal, and we're going to navigate to the folder where we have our Docker Compose file. So in here, I do have 2 Docker Compose files. That's one with traffic and one without. And there's a handy way in which we can specify which one we want. So the one we want is denoted by using the -f command, if ever you've wondered. And we're just saying -f, so the file is Docker Compose traffic. And if you've ever used something like kubectl, you'll have seen that where you can specify the YAML file you want, the manifest file. So running this and entering my password, this is going to go away and it's going to pull those images, and hopefully we'll have something up and running. Whilst it's doing this, you do obviously want to make sure that you've got things like the ent.jimsgarage and the min.io. You'll want to make sure that you've got domain records in your domain resolution service that points to the IP of your Docker host. So I've been into my Pi-hole and I've already configured all of that. Now, as you can see here, all of that pulled down. those got provisioned, healthy, and started. So let's jump into Portainer and let's just double check all of that. So over in Portainer here, you'll see that I've got MinIOs running, the provision, because it's an ephemeral container. It basically loaded up, configured this, and then got rid of itself. We've got Museum, Postgres, SOCAT, so everything's up and running as we would expect. And if we jump into something, say, like Museum, and we'll come on to this in a minute, we can see down here that everything is up and running, and it's listening and serving on port 8080, which is what we expected. Remember, that's being put behind a reverse proxy. So one handy way to know that this has worked is to go to the following URL. So it's ent.jimsgarage.co.uk, and we want to hit /ping. Now if we do /ping, let me make that larger, we get a pong. Great. And what that means is the service is up and running. If you were to go to this website and you didn't get that message, something's not right. You can obviously also go to the IP and the :8080 and you should get this same message. It's always good to validate that this is up and running first. Otherwise, if we try the next step, which is attaching this via a client, it's not going to work. This has to be up and running before you can even create your account and log in. So let's now head on to actually using this. So we want to head over to their website and we want to download the desktop client, or you can also download the mobile client if you want. And it's as straightforward as going to your app store and downloading that application. So over on their website, we can go to the download tab and just choose which one you want to use. So download for desktop, and then I've downloaded the Windows one. So once that's downloaded, we're going to start installing it. So I've just off screen, it's come up on the other monitor. I've double clicked that exe file, and now we are granted with this here. Now, this by default will want to use the hosted service by Ente, and you can go ahead and do that if you want. Do note what's also useful, if you click on view, you can get the dev tools. This is quite handy for debugging. You can go to the console and you'll see any error messages here. And there also is a help and a view logs. And if you click that, you'll be able to see the log file in here for everything that's going on. I had to make use of this more than I wanted to during testing. But anyway, I'm going to close that down. And the secret here is to click this 7 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we get the endpoint here where we can change and specify. So obviously we want to go to https://ent.jimsgarage.co.uk and hit return. So you'll know that worked because that pop-up went away, and you'll see down here now it's connecting to ent.jimsgarage.co.uk. So we don't have an account, but I haven't found that to be a problem. So I'm going to put my email address in here. So jim@jimsgarage.co.uk, and I'm going to hit login. Now that will actually create an account. I didn't have to register. And the best way to have this set up is to do SMTP, because it will send you an email to that email address and it will have that code in it. Don't worry, that's not a real email address, so don't spam me. But what we can do is we can go back to Portainer, and we'll see in this log here that we should have the code. So here's the code, 799445. So if we hop back now, 799445, and we hit return, boom, we're in. So now we need to create a password. So it needs to have various complexities. So make sure you choose something suitable, and this will be used to generate your keys. So I'm going to click set password, and you'll see here that it's generating those encryption keys. Now these will be the encryption keys that are used to encrypt all of your files and send them to the server. So as it's saying on the screen here, it is imperative that you keep a hold of these keys and keep them safe. So we'll save those keys and we'll download those. Next, it's going to ask you to choose your plan. You can actually just ignore that. And there is a way to get rid of where it says the 5 gig limit and all of that stuff, but it's not really a problem for this video. So the thing we want to do first to test that this works is to upload our first photo. So we want to click that button there. We want to go to the files or a folder or a Google Takeout. You can basically sync it and pull down all of your Google files. I'm just going to demonstrate that this is working with a local file. So click File. I found some files of me cycling around on Zwift. So I'll click Open. Now you can create different albums, which is pretty awesome, or I'm just going to stick it in uncategorized for this video, and hopefully, yeah, bingo, that uploaded and it all worked fine. So that in a nutshell is it working. So now I could go through, pull all of my Google Photos, everything I've got on my local machine, or I could now hop on over onto my mobile device and do the same process. Now, what's cool is the mobile device, basically the setup is exactly the same. You download the app, you tap the logo 7 times, you specify the endpoint, and you can log in with this same account. And it also then has the handy feature of you can back up folder locations. So all of your WhatsApp, all of your storage on your local device, or even linked it up to your Google account. That will then automatically back up and behave exactly like things like Google Cloud, iCloud, etc. Anytime you take a photograph, as long as it's got the permissions, it's going to upload that to your server, provided it's got access. So remember, if you're out and about, you will need to port forward this, or at least be connected to a VPN for this to work. But now we have a little bit of a problem. So if we click on here, you'll see that I'm now using 0.6 megs of 5 gigabytes. And you might be thinking, well, hey, this is self-hosted. Why is there a cap on how much I've got to use? Well, I think that stems from because this is probably the container they use in their production environment, and it hasn't quite been updated yet. Like I say, it's only been out in open source for a few months. But good news is there is a way to get around this. The bad news is it's a little bit clunky at the moment, but I'll help you out. So by the end of this, we will have this set to 100 terabytes. I don't actually know what happens if you've got more than 100 terabytes. Do let me know, but that should be more than enough for most users. So what we need to do is download the command line interface. There are a few ways to do that. You can run it as a Docker container, or you can just download the binary and do it in Windows, which is what I'm going to do because that's probably the simplest option. And odds are you're not going to be going through this CLI route lots of times. The way it works is basically this account here I created. This is sort of just a user account. It's actually an admin account, but it's not yet set up to be an admin account. More on that in a moment. So to get this up and running, let's head over and download the CLI. You'll need to go to GitHub and you'll need to download one of the releases that they've got, or you can build it yourself. I'm just going to go with the releases, so I click on here. And I'm going to scroll down, check out the assets, and then just download the version that's right for the operating system you're using. For this video, I use the 0.21 AMD 64.zip, and you just want to start that download process. Now that that download has finished, I've exported it just to a folder in my downloads folder, and here's the ent.exe file that we need, and also a config.yaml file. In the config.yaml file, I've just taken this from their GitHub, you'll see here critically the endpoint and API. Now, by default, it's going to use this config file, which is in the same folder as the CLI executable. And all you need to do is change this API to where your ent is hosted. So for me, it's behind a reverse proxy at this address. But if you're not using a proxy or you've got a different DNS, put your IP port or your DNS in there. And that's pretty much all you need to do. Now that we've got this here, we should be able to right click and open the terminal. And we should be able to start using the command line interface. So if we do a / and then a ent.exe, we can do -- help, and yeah, that's up and running now. So the first thing we actually need to do is to create a user. Now that might sound a bit funny. That's because CLI users are different to the ones we created in the web GUI. The one we created in the web GUI, because it's the first user, is actually the admin, but we need to tie the command line user that we're going to create in a minute to that user we created earlier. That sounds complex, but actually it's pretty simple. All we need to do is use the same credentials and password. It's actually just the email address and the password, and it will match those two up. Once we've done that, we get an ID for that user. We can then go back to the Docker Compose file, add that ID as an admin, restart, and fingers crossed, everything should be up and running. So let's get into that. Let's create this user first. So the syntax for creating a user is account, add, and then the name. So because this is Jim at Jim's Garage, I'm going to call it Jim. So I'm going to hit return. Then it's going to say enter the app type, the default being photos, which is what I want it to be. So hit return. Now it's going to say enter the export directory. Now this is because the CLI gives you the capability to export everything in your Ent application, i.e. your photos. Remember, you can't just copy them out of the Ent's container because they're encrypted. What this will do is decrypt it for you and give you a copy of your unencrypted data. So the export directory, so this is going to be local to where the CLI is. So this is why in the background, sorry it's small, there's an export folder there. You can call this whatever you want. And so I'm just going to call this one export, and hopefully that found it. Yes, it did. Now's the important bit, don't get this wrong. So I'll put in Jim at jimsgarage.co.uk. That looks right. And now it's going to ask me the password. Now this is the same password I used during the creation in the GUI that you saw earlier. So hitting return, it's going to try and authenticate, and if you've got everything right, yes, the account was created successfully. And so now we've got that right. So what we can do now is if we do / and then we do the ent again, we can do accounts and we should be able to do list. Account list. Now I've actually got two here just because I was doing some testing earlier, but the one we want is this one here where the export directory was export, not meh. So what we need to do is copy this value here. So we'll copy this one. Now we need to take that and we need to copy that into our museum.yaml file in a separate section. So what we need to do is we need to go into our museum.yaml file, which we discussed earlier. And you'll see here I've created this section, internal, admins, and then I've copied the value we just had. So once that's done, we want to hit save. We want to go back to Portainer. We want to find museum, which is this one here, and then just restart that container. That should now pick up the new museum settings. Now, once we've done that and it's applied, that means now that museum knows that our account, this one here, is an admin. So what we can do now is use this account in the CLI to make our GUI account, which are now linked, an admin user with unlimited storage. So the command to do that looks like this. And what it's saying is it's doing an admin command in the CLI. It's saying to update the subscription of the user using the admin count of Jim, which we just set up. And the user is going to be Jim again, the one we did in the GUI, and it's setting no limit to true. So once we click enter, it says successfully updated the storage and expiry date for the user. So hopefully, if we now go back to Ent Photos and we click on here, you'll see we've now got 100 terabytes of space. Excellent. And you can repeat this process in the background for all of your users. So anyone you've got who you want to have unlimited storage, or obviously you can define a storage if you want to, and that should apply to that user. Now, as I also mentioned, what this can do is to perform an export. So let's quickly do an export in case you ever wanted to get your photographs out of this, albeit things like I've demonstrated before with things like Restic as part of that 3-2-1 backup strategy. That would be good for backing up the encrypted volume. This will be good for getting that encrypted data out of the volume. So now that we've got everything configured and we are the default admin, we should be able to do an ent.exe and an export. Now what that did, it started the sync, it did for uncategorized where we put it, downloaded, it processed it, and it didn't skip anything. So hopefully if we look into the folder now, we should see our file. And so now back to this export folder, which was in the exe. Export, remember we had uncategorized, so it even kept the categorization. Here we go. And within uncategorized, we've now should have this image. Yeah, there we go. So brilliant. We've now created an admin account, we've changed the storage amounts, and we've also shown that we can download unencrypted versions of our encrypted photos. So you've got that for a backup. So thanks for watching, everybody. Hopefully that was useful and it's given you the confidence now to go away and spin this up for yourself and give you the opportunity to protect your photos with end-to-end encryption wherever you are. The beauty of that is you can then confidently give this out to other people and they can be safe in the knowledge that you can't actually see their photos. To demonstrate that, we can obviously go to the min.io container I mentioned earlier. We can hit login and then on here you'll see 5.7 megs. These are the file I just uploaded, and in here, where is it? It'll be this one here, 2.5 meg. That's the actual picture I uploaded. So you could download that file or whatever, but it's safe in the knowledge that it's encrypted. So let me know what you think of Ente. Is this something you're going to use? I think it ticks a major box over its competitors, things like Immich and Photoprism, because it does do that end-to-end encryption. The downside is obviously you've got everything in a single database now and it's not mapped to like a local file storage, so if you do get a database corruption, you could lose everything. But provided you're regularly backing up, etc., you can probably mitigate the likelihood of that happening. As always, if you've liked this video, give it a thumbs up, hit that subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Take care, everybody.